Colonel Robert McCormick, the right-wing editor of the Chicago Tribune, who had been one of MacArthur's greatest fans, was so upset when he heard about the general's socialist reforms that he flew to Japan to discover for himself what was going on. His worst fears confirmed, he abandoned his campaign to make MacArthur President of the United States. Japan's gain would be America's loss. Paragraph 13 of the secret directive stipulated that you will not assume any responsibility for the economic rehabilitation of Japan or the strengthening of the Japanese economy. America did not want to recreate Japan's capacity for waging war. However, an exception was made where the interests of the occupation authorities were concerned. An example was provided by the various public communication systems which, when the occupation began, were in a shambles. Telephones, telegraphs, and radio stations scarcely functioned. There were very few radio sets in the hand of the public. Most central and switching telephone and telegraph systems, as well as the interconnecting lines, had been destroyed by bombing. What remained was mostly unusable due to neglect before, during, and before the war. Few technicians were available to effect repairs, and for those still there, travel was almost impossible. The small military advance party, which landed at Atsugi Airport near Tokyo on August the 28th, 1945, 2 years before the general arrived, had consisted mostly of members of the U.S. Army Signal Corps. After completing its work in connection with the surrender, the Corps' principal task would be to create a Civil Communications Section, or CCS, within the Supreme Commander's headquarters. CCS was formally established on October the 2nd, 1945. Its staff consisted of civilian engineers, drawn mostly from American Telephone and Telegraph, from that company's manufacturing arm, Western Electric, from its regional affiliates, always known as the Baby Bells, and from the research laboratory, the Bell Laboratory. The civil communication systems were reconnected with commendable speed, but were frequently out of action for the lack of reliable equipment. Congress had refused to meet the cost of exporting American-made goods. For the CCS, consequently, the most intractable problem was the lack of local manufacturing capacity capable of producing equipment of adequate quality. The CCS's industry division, where our engineers worked, became in effect a management consultancy whose principal occupation was teaching contemporary American management methods to the Japanese communication equipment manufacturers. The reforms promoted by the CCS to industry would have been ineffective without the so-called economic purges that MacArthur imposed in 1947 on all of Japanese manufacturing, and not just on the makers of communication equipment. A total of 1,937 company executives at the level of managing director or above in 154 large companies were dismissed. No compensation was offered. Some of the men dismissed ended up driving taxis. These purges were undertaken primarily for political reasons, to discourage Japan from becoming a warlike nation again, but the occupation forces were not unaware of their purely economic implications. According to Colonel Charles Cadiz, who has been called the second most important member of the occupation forces after General MacArthur, the Americans thought that putting new blood into top executive positions would be good for Japanese industry. In the early days of the occupation, the communications equipment manufacturers had to be taught the virtue of cleanliness. Soon after he arrived, one of the American engineers, who was called Homer Saracen, visited a small Japanese company with a large name situated in the Shinagawa section of Tokyo, the Tokyo Telecommunications Engineering Company, or TTK. I won't try to say it in Japanese. The listed company was under $600. The minuscule staff was housed in a few dilapidated army huts, where in a rainstorm the executives had to work with umbrellas over their desks. To reach the hut, the visitors had to duck under clotheslines on which neighbours hung their children's diapers. Bomb damage was everywhere. Thinking that the little company had potential, Saracen approved the award of an order for a sophisticated audio mixing console on behalf of the Japanese National Broadcasting Company, an organization modelled on RBBC. Hearing nothing for some time, he paid a surprise visit to the factory. The workplace was dirty. The components lay about covered in dust. The design was crude and incomplete. Neither the president of the company nor the chief engineer was present. Saracen called the staff together to discuss what should be done, but they were unresponsive. No one wished to sweep the floor. To make his displeasure clear, Saracen did something that would be rude in any country, but was especially so in Japan. He stood up in the middle of the meeting and walked out without a word. Shortly afterwards, the president and the chief engineer arrived in his office full of apologies. They wanted to know what specifically they should do. Saracen told them what was expected. The company responded well to the challenge and produced an excellent mixer console, and it was on time. As a result, the company received many more such orders under the auspices of CCS. The small company with a large name in time became a large company with a small name, Sony. The change to the new title took place in 1958. The president and chief executive who called on Saracen were its founders, Masahara Ibuka and Akio Morita. Sony would become famous for technical innovation and quality in the consumer electronics market. It adapted the newly invented transistor for radios and other small household appliances, making possible our modern electronic world. It set new standards for color television and invented and popularized the Walkman. Later it was foolish enough to acquire Columbia Pictures and CBS Records.